sound of brief introductory audio reform thinking. Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of sources, research, and notes and distill the most crucial knowledge-rich nuggets for you. Today, we're really getting into one of the clearest initial arguments for a directing intelligence behind the universe ever put to paper.
It is a genuine pleasure to get into this material with you. Our core text today is C.S. Lewis's classic, Mere Christianity. And we're really zeroing in on the early philosophical architecture of his case, the chapter he calls What Lies Behind the Law. It's designed to move you, the listener, step by step from observable reality to a theological necessity.
And our mission for this deep dive is to give you a quick but still very thorough grasp of Lewis's opening move. How does he get from this common human experience, that sense of conscience, of obligation, to a necessary philosophical conclusion about a guiding mind? This dive is really structured to arm you with the full force of his logic.
Lewis's method here is so helpful because he intentionally starts on common ground. He doesn't begin with church doctrine or, special revelation. He starts with observation, the world and human nature. And he uses that to build a premise that, once it's established, gives you a reasoned foundation for understanding a sovereign creator. And the existence of a moral law written on the human heart, which is a concept so central to our Reformed understanding. He builds the premise before he ever gets to the creed.
Okay, so let's unpack this setup. He begins by categorizing what we call laws. He starts with the laws of nature.
Right. These are the laws that govern everything physical. So gravity, thermodynamics, how stones behave, how trees grow. When you look at the physical cosmos, you see these fixed, observable patterns.
And this is where Lewis introduces his first really critical move. When we talk about the physical laws of nature, he suggests that these might just be descriptions of how nature behaves. They may not be a separate real thing at all. They're just our way of, making sense of the observed facts.
Let's spend a minute on that distinction because it's key. If I drop a tennis ball and it always falls down, the law of gravity is really just the descriptive label we're putting on the consistency of that behavior.
It describes the fact. The law isn't some separate binding rule that the tennis ball decides to follow. The law is the falling.
Correct. For a physical object, Lewis is suggesting the laws governing it might not be anything above and beyond the actual facts themselves. A stone can't disobey the law of gravity. If it suddenly stopped obeying it, we wouldn't say the stone broke the law. We'd just have to change our description of the law.
It's just what is.
Yes, it's a technical term for the pattern we see.
But then we pivot, and we pivot sharply to humanity, and this is where the whole conversation changes. We run into the law of human nature, or the law of right and wrong, the moral law.
And this law cannot, by its very nature, be just a description of human behavior.
That is the pivotal switch. This is the human anomaly.
It is. We observe the facts of human action every day. You see selfishness, kindness, honesty, betrayal, all of it. Yet when we talk about the moral law, we're talking about a separate, real standard, a law that dictates what we ought to do no matter what we actually do.
Let's try to illustrate that separation. If the moral law were just descriptive, like gravity, then whatever most people do is the law. So if most people routinely lie to get ahead, then the law of human nature would simply be lie when it's convenient.
Precisely. But the undeniable internal reality is that even the person who lies knows they're breaking a separate real standard. They often feel that sense of obligation they failed to meet. The law of the stone tells us what is happening. The moral law tells us what should be happening. And that should stays real and binding even when everyone fails to meet it.
I think a lot of listeners, when they hear this, their first objection is probably, is this just social conditioning? Aren't these just conventions we made up like traffic laws or etiquette? If I use the wrong fork at a fancy dinner, I might feel a little awkward, but I don't feel this deep, soul-wrenching guilt. So Lewis has to explain why the moral law is different from a mere convention.
And he does, very robustly. While conventions can vary widely between cultures, different table manners, different driving rules, the moral law shows this remarkable universality in its principles. The specific way justice is carried out might change, but the idea that one should be just or that helping others is better than hurting them, that seems inescapable.
And it's more than just the universality, it's the quality of the internal feeling. That's the real test.
Yes. We might feel awkward breaking a rule of etiquette, but we feel responsible and indebted when we break the moral law.
Responsibility and debt. That's the key. If I invent a convention, I can just as easily get rid of it. If a government decides that tomorrow all traffic should drive on the left, they could just change the law.
Yeah.
But no one, not even the most cynical person, can just erase that internal feeling that, say, gratuitous cruelty is wrong, or that feeling of discomfort that comes with knowing you betrayed someone's trust. It feels binding, as if it's stamped onto our nature.
Unlike the stone, which is compelled by its descriptive law, a person is commanded to obey a prescriptive moral law. We have the choice to follow it or resist it. And if we resist it, we immediately run into that internal mechanism of guilt, which Lewis uses as evidence that the law is external to our desires and not something we made up. This sense of obligation is what makes man so unique in the observed universe.
So establishing this internal independent moral law is Lewis's absolutely necessary first step. Because if this law of right and wrong exists, if it is something above and beyond what we just see in human behavior, then we're immediately forced to look for an external source.
And that brings us to the two fundamental explanations for the universe.
Based on centuries of human thought, Lewis boils the options down to two sort of rough worldviews. The first one is the materialist view.
The materialist position is the assertion that everything we see, matter, space, time, it just exists. There's no underlying reason for it, no intelligence, no plan. It's the position of ultimate, undirected chance, coupled with fuxed, mechanical laws.
And according to this view, everything that followed, including life and our own consciousness, is just the result of a long, improbable chain of random physical events, governed only by those fixed material laws. Lewis is very specific in laying out this cosmic narrative of chance.
He is. He details the timeline. A huge initial chance collision created the sun and planets. Then, on this tiny little planet, another fantastic chance, a specific, precise combination of chemicals, temperature, and atmospheric pressure resulted in life spontaneously coming from non-life.
And the subsequent development of creatures like us, who can sit here and analyze philosophy, is simply the result of a very long series of chances. Our consciousness, our hopes, our minds, they're all just accidental byproducts of chemistry and material arrangement. No intention, no purpose, just a mechanical process grinding away.
And then, in stark contrast, you have the religious view. This view posits that the ultimate reality behind the entire universe is more like a mind than anything else we can really conceptualize.
When Lewis uses the term mind here, we should be clear, he doesn't mean a brain and a skull. He means an entity that is conscious, that has intention, that can make selections, preferring one thing over another, and has purposes.
And if that's true, then the universe was not an accident. It was made, at least in part, for defined purposes. One of those purposes was to produce creatures capable of having minds, creatures that share a certain likeness with the creator entity itself, which aligns perfectly with the concept of the imago Dei.
Now, Lewis inserts a crucial philosophical boundary here, and we really need to dwell on it because it's so often misunderstood today. He states that you cannot possibly figure out which of these two views, materialism or the religious view, is correct using science in the ordinary sense.
This point is absolutely essential. Science is defined by its method, external observation and reproducible experiments. It watches how things behave inside the universe.
And no matter how sophisticated the equipment gets, every honest scientific statement just boils down to an observation of fact. It's documentation. I aimed the Webb telescope at this galaxy and saw that light signature. Or, I mixed these two compounds under these conditions and they reacted in this measurable way. That is the legitimate, honest job of science.
It deals with facts, patterns, and mechanisms. And Lewis notes that the greatest, most cautious scientists in history agree on this limitation. They know what their tools are designed to measure.
But the very questions that separate materialism from the religious view are entirely outside science's reach. Even if science someday knew every single thing in the whole universe, every atom's position, every interaction, the big philosophical questions would still be there, unchanged.
Right.
Why is there a universe at all? Why do these laws exist? Does the whole apparatus have any underlying meaning or direction?
These questions deal with cause and meaning, which are realities of a different kind. A reality that, by definition, has to stand behind the physical facts that science observes. We can only observe things within the system. We cannot, using those same tools, look at the cause of the system.
So if there's something behind the physical reality, it's just not observable by the instruments of science. Science is designed to observe objects in the house. It is incapable of observing the architect who designed the house because the architect isn't structurally part of the house.
And this leads to Lewis's subtle warning. The claims that science has either proven or disproven the existence of a guiding mind are, philosophically speaking, not statements of science. Lewis observed that the people who make these broad, absolute claims are often not the primary scientists doing the difficult, detailed work.
He suggests those claims often come from the journalists and popular novelists who have picked up a few odds and ends of half-baked science from textbooks. End quote. They take the legitimate description of a mechanism like evolution, and then they leap across a philosophical chasm to assert that the mechanism proves there is no meaning. And that's a conclusion the science itself just cannot support.
It's a logical category error. Science can tell us the properties of hydrogen and oxygen when they combine. It can't tell us the meaning or purpose of water or whether water should exist. To answer that deeper question of meaning, we need a different kind of evidence entirely.
And that evidence is precisely what Lewis has already established in Section 1. It's the cue we already have. We've established that the situation looks, well, entirely hopeless if we rely only on external observation, whether we're looking at cabbages or stars or even other human beings. But Lewis reminds us, there is one thing and only one thing in the entire universe that we know more about that we can learn just by watching it.
And that one thing, of course, is ourselves. Man.
We aren't external observers of humanity. We are human. We are in the know. We have what Lewis called inside information. So what is that inside information?
It's the moral law. We know from the inside that we are not just collections of chemicals reacting to stimulus. We know we are under a moral standard we didn't invent, which we ought to obey, and which insists on responsibility. This internal experience is the unique, crucial data point.
Let's run the thought experiment that Lewis suggests. Imagine some brilliant alien researcher trying to study humanity the same way we study the behavior of electricity or how a cabbage grows. They're external, they can't communicate, they're just observing physical actions.
That external observer could map every neurological connection, catalog every social interaction, and probably predict 99% of our actions, and yet they would never discover the existence of the moral law.
Why not? Because their instruments only record what we did, the facts of behavior. They record the fact that a man stole money. The moral law, though, is concerned with what he ought not to have done. That sense of ought is totally invisible to external observation. It doesn't have space or mass.
Now, apply that same principle to the rest of the cosmos. If there were a power behind the facts of the weather or the movement of a planet, we, by just observing those things externally, would have zero hope of discovering that power's intentions or commands. We'd only ever see the physical manifestations, the facts.
This is where Lewis brings in the architect analogy, which helps us understand where this power must show up if it exists at all.
If there's a controlling power that stands outside the physical universe, if it is the architect of the house, it cannot possibly appear as one of the facts inside the universe. If the architect suddenly showed up as a misplaced brick or a new piece of furniture, he would just be another fact for us to observe.
Right, the architect is the designer and the governor of the house, but he isn't physically part of the walls or the flooring or the roof. So if the architect wanted to communicate with the people inside the house, he'd have to do it in a way that wasn't structural, right?
Yes, exactly. The communication would have to be internal to the inhabitant, a command, an instruction. Lewis concludes that the only way we could expect this controlling power to show itself is inside ourselves, manifesting not as a physical phenomenon, but as a command trying to get us to behave in a certain way.
And this is the moment of recognition that command is just what we find. It's the moral law. This realization shouldn't just arouse suspicion. He's saying it should be treated as undeniable evidence.
The logic loop is now closed. In every case where we don't get an answer about the purpose or meaning of an object, the stars, the weather, the stones, we understand why. External observation is limited, and it can't see the architect. But in the one solitary case where we can expect an answer, man, the being with interior consciousness, the answer is a clear yes. There is an external command.
This gives us the only solid foothold we have for making an inference about the nature of the entire universe. It's like his analogy of the postman and the packets. We see a man in a uniform leaving these uniform-looking paper packets at every house down the street.
And why do we assume those other packets contain letters? Because the only packet we are allowed to open our own contains a letter. We don't assume the neighbors are getting packets full of sand or stones, even though we haven't seen inside their packets. We generalize based on the one piece of inside information we have.
And the packet we are allowed to open is man. When we look inside ourselves, we find we are receiving a communication, a binding moral law, which implies there's a sender of letters or a director.
The question then becomes, okay, if the moral law is a command sent to man, what kind of communication is sent to a stone or a tree? Is the stone also, internally striving to follow gravity? Lewis says no, the expectation is different because the entities are different.
He establishes a difference in governance. The sender compels the stone to obey the law of its stony nature. A stone is an automaton. It has no choice but to follow fixed physical behavior like gravity. The law is descriptive compulsion.
Whereas the sender tells man to obey the law of his human nature, the moral law, this is a prescriptive command. And this implies freedom, the capacity for choice, and therefore the possibility of failure and responsibility.
So the mode of governance differs radically, compulsion for matter, command for conscious beings. But the implication in both cases is the same, the existence of a governor, a power behind the facts, a director. The moral law is the unique data point that forces us away from the purely materialist worldview because it introduces a non-physical reality, the imperative of ought.
And we have to maintain Lewis's philosophical rigor here.
We do. We've established the necessity of a director, but we must stress that the conclusion he has reached at this moment is not yet the God of the Bible or the triune God of Christian theology.
Absolutely. Lewis is very deliberate. All we have established so far is the existence of something which is directing the universe, and that this something manifests itself within us as an uncomfortable moral law, a law that urges us to do right and generates genuine guilt when we do wrong.
So what can we logically deduce about the nature of this something? If we accept the materialist premise that the only other option is just matter, the answer becomes clearer by, well, by elimination.
We must assume this reality is more like a mind than anything else we know. Lewis's point here is beautifully simple and intuitive. You can hardly imagine a bit of matter giving instructions.
Instructions, commands, purpose, preference, these are all functions of consciousness. A piece of carbon or a cloud of gas can't issue a moral imperative. Matter can cause force, but it can't express disappointment over broken honesty or pride over a noble deed. The evidence of the moral law points inescapably toward intelligence and preference.
But we need to acknowledge the nuance Lewis brings here, though. He offers a necessary caution. This something may not be very like a mind, and it's certainly not like a person in the way we typically define personality. It is infinite, eternal, but based solely on the unique evidence of the moral law. The analogy of a mind or a director or a governor is the best, most rational fit. It is the only thing we know of that issues commands.
And before Lewis moves on to discuss how we might find out more about this director, he offers a word of warning to the reader. He makes it very clear that he is not dealing in the kind of weak, sentimental ideas of divinity that were popular in his time, the soft soap, as he calls it, often discussed regarding some benign, non-judgmental entity.
This is a nod to the gravity of the moral law. If this directing reality exists and it issues a command that we are constantly and, well, profoundly failing to keep, that is not a comfortable thought. The something we've discovered is inherently demanding, potentially troublesome, and necessarily righteous. It is a holy God whose law requires a response, which aligns powerfully with the reformed concept of God's sovereignty and our responsibility before him. Lewis makes sure the reader understands the serious, non-negotiable nature of the reality he has just proven.
It sets the stage by removing all the sentimental fluff. If the existence of God is proved by this inner sense of guilt and responsibility, then that God is necessarily a severe judge before he's anything else.
That's right.
Lewis is meticulous, and he realizes that there is a tempting philosophical escape route, a third option that tries to sit between materialism and the religious view. He addresses this in a detailed critique of what he calls the life force philosophy.
This in-between view goes by a few names: creative evolution, life force, or emergent evolution. It tries to acknowledge the dynamism and progression of life without committing to a personal, judging creator. Lewis points to Bernard Shaw for the wittiest explanations of this, and to Bergson for the most detailed.
And the core idea is appealing, isn't it? The small, crucial variations that led to life evolving from the lowest forms up to human consciousness weren't due to blind chance alone, like the materialists claim. Instead, they were caused by the striving or the purposiveness of an intrinsic, impersonal life force.
It's a view that seeks the comfort of having a purposeful universe. It says, yes, there is direction, there's momentum, there's a driving creative impetus, but it very carefully avoids saying there is a person demanding moral behavior. It wants the grandeur of purpose without the governance of a mind.
But Lewis immediately sees the logical weakness and asks the single devastating question that just collapses the entire philosophy.
He does. Does this life force have a mind, or does it not?
And the answer dictates everything.
It does. If the proponents admit that the life force does have a mind, a consciousness that guides life's trajectory toward perfection, then the view is redundant. It's just the religious view with a different label. They're just calling God the life force, but the core essence of a conscious, selecting, purposeful guide is still there.
But if they stand their ground and say the life force does not have a mind, that it's blind, unconscious energy, then Lewis asks, what definition of language lets us say that something without a mind strives or has purposes?
Striving and purpose are human terms. They come exclusively from our experience of consciousness. We only use words like strive or intend when we're talking about things that have a mind. To apply these terms to an unconscious blind force is to empty the words of all meaning. The life force, if it's truly blind, just collapses logically back into materialism. It's just matter and chance again, maybe dressed up in slightly more poetic language.
It seems like Lewis sees this life force philosophy not as a serious philosophical third way, but more as a psychological coping mechanism.
Hmm.
He asks why it's so attractive to people.
He argues its attractiveness is that it lets you enjoy the emotional comfort of believing in a great cosmic power without any of the less pleasant consequences that come with acknowledging a personal, holy God.
Let's really get into that emotional appeal. When you're feeling good, when life is moving forward, the life force lets you feel sophisticated and spiritual. You can imagine this great mysterious energy rolling through the centuries, and you feel carried along by it, part of some vast, inspiring cosmic process. You get the metaphysical thrill.
But then when you decide you want to act rather shabby, when you break a promise or cut a corner or do some morally questionable thing, the life force is conveniently just a blind force. It has no morals and no mind, and therefore it will never interfere. It can't judge you because it lacks the capacity for judgment.
This is the genius of Lewis's critique. He calls the life force a sort of tame god. It's a deity you can praise when you feel like it and then completely ignore when it becomes inconvenient. You get the benefit of purpose when you want inspiration and the benefit of moral neutrality when you want to act selfishly.
His final judgment is severe, but it's accurate. Creative evolution offers all the thrills of religion and none of the cost. Lewis provocatively suggests that the life force philosophy might be the single greatest achievement of wishful thinking the world has ever seen.
It serves as a stark foil to the conclusion of Section 4, doesn't it? The moral law proves a director who is demanding and troublesome because we failed to keep his commands. The life force is a philosophical attempt to create a morally neutral director that asks nothing of us, which eliminates the problem posed by our persistent judgmental conscience. It's seeking the benefits of creation while actively resisting the authority of the creator. Lewis's earlier argument proved necessary.
Well said.
So this deep dive followed Lewis's methodical path perfectly. We established that the moral law, that troublesome internal sense of ought, is the only key we are allowed to open. And when we open ourselves, we find clear evidence pointing to a director of the universe that is, by necessity, more like a mind capable of command than simple random matter.
And this rigorous establishment of a moral lawgiver fits so naturally into the theological framework of the Reformed tradition. The doctrine of the Imago Dei confirms that this law is written onto our hearts, making us responsible, accountable creatures standing before a righteous creator. Lewis's philosophical proof gives powerful structure to the theological assertions of man's accountability.
And as it's described in the Westminster Confession, man's chief purpose and rule of life are entirely bound up in acknowledging and obeying the will of this director, this holy God. Lewis moves us from a philosophical puzzle to a very personal reality. The moral standard is real, and the authority behind it is real.
Let us end by returning to that core distinction that Lewis provided between compulsion and command. Ponder the weighty implications of this fundamental difference. The sender of the letters compels the stone to obey its nature, but he tells man to obey his nature.
That distinction is the foundation of our existence as moral free creatures. What does it truly mean for human freedom and responsibility that we are subjects of a moral command capable of failure and rebellion, rather than unthinking automatons just following mechanical laws?
And if the existence of that necessary, troublesome God, the one who commands obedience, is demonstrably true through our own conscience, what is the ultimate cost of rejecting him in favor of the emotional comfort provided by the tame God of blind evolutionary purpose? It asks us to consider whether we're suppressing the clearest piece of evidence we possess about the nature of the reality we inhabit simply because that evidence makes us uncomfortable.
Food for thought indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into C.S. Lewis's analysis of the law behind the law.
Until next time.